We now present For the Record.
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Will Keneally. On Friday, the Wisconsin Supreme Court handed down a major decision to uphold Governor Evers' 400-year veto. Now, the 4-3 decision keeps in place the governor's powerful line-item veto power, and writing for the majority, Justice Jill Karofsky said that the court is acutely, quote, aware that a 400-year modification is both significant and attention-grabbing. However, our Constitution does not limit the governor's partial veto power based on how much or how little the partial vetoes change policy, even when that change is considerable. Now, two things that this decision does: it extends that school funding, certainly, but it also keeps in place that governor's veto power there. Now, lawmakers in the state capitol were largely waiting for this decision to come down before deciding how to move forward on the state budget process. Now, in response to that decision, Assembly Speaker Robin Vos said that the Supreme Court's partisan decision today should worry every Wisconsinite. The governor can now raise property taxes unchecked by any other branch of our government for hundreds of years. Now, for more on the impact of this, we're joined by Brenna Gadar, an attorney with the UW Law School's State Democracy Research Initiative, and thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Now, I first want to acknowledge that you filed an amicus brief in this case, and we'll get to that in a little bit here. But I want to start with your legal expertise first. The governor's veto works a little bit differently here in Wisconsin compared to the president federally. Can you describe how that works here in Wisconsin?
Yes, so a lot of states have this partial veto that allows the governor to strike parts of an appropriations bill to really sort of combat log rolling and a bunch of measures getting bundled into this big budget bill. But Wisconsin's is the most powerful in the country. It really allows the governor to selectively edit words, or in this case, digits, to sort of create new law.
And so that's the interesting thing there for me. This deals with just those appropriation bills, right? It has to have some kind of money attached to it.
Yes, this is just for appropriations bills. This really came about in response to these huge omnibus budget bills being passed. It used to be that appropriations were done one bill at a time, and so the governor could veto the whole bill. But now that it's done in this massive bill, the governor's veto had less power because he would need to veto the entire budget in order to change one provision or veto one provision. And so that's how this originated about a century ago.
This veto power has gotten pared back a little bit in recent decades. We've seen some changes to this, right?
Yes, we've seen some changes through constitutional amendments that the legislature has proposed and voters have passed, prohibiting the governor from taking parts of multiple sentences and creating a new sentence from parts of multiple sentences, and then also prohibiting the governor from striking out individual letters in words to create entirely new words that weren't there before.
Now, turning to this week's decision, it seems like it might have been a little bit of a foregone conclusion, right? The court has a 4-3 liberal majority. Were you surprised at all by what happened?
I was actually somewhat surprised by the result. During oral argument, a lot of justices, including the liberal-leaning justices, expressed some skepticism about whether this is the direction that this power is meant to go and whether this is the type of thing that was intended under the Wisconsin Constitution.
Anything that stuck out to you from the opinions?
Yeah, so I think what stood out the most is that this opinion by the majority was really based on the court's precedent. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court over many decades has approved increasingly creative vetoes by the governor. And so its precedent sets really very few guardrails around what that veto can look like. And the petitioners in this case weren't asking the court to overturn that precedent. And so the majority really sort of relied on that in finding that this veto was constitutional. But there was some openness from at least 4 justices on the court, including the 3 dissenters, to potentially revisiting that precedent in the future.
So as you say there, even after this decision, this issue may not be dead?
Definitely not. I think we will almost certainly see continued litigation on this. There's already another partial veto case that's pending before the court that they just heard oral argument in it, but it's on a slightly different issue. But I'm sure we'll see more on this editing veto question going forward.
And I want to touch briefly on your amicus brief in this case. Why did you decide to weigh in?
Yeah, so we filed a brief on behalf of a Columbia law professor, Richard Berfault. He has studied the partial veto nationwide and has reached the conclusion that Wisconsin is very much an outlier here. And so the brief really focused on the purposes of the partial veto, which was really to restore a democratic measure and give strength back to the veto power. And so we argued, well, it's intended to be a broad power and intended to give the governor this sort of balancing of omnibus budget bills. It's not something that was intended to allow the governor to do what he did here, which involved striking individual digits and dashes to create a year that just never was in the provision to begin with.
Renee Gadar, thank you. When we come back, we speak with one of the co-chairs of the Legislative Audit Committee, looking into the recent results of an audit of diversity, equity, and inclusion across state government. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. A week ago, the Legislative Audit Bureau released the results of an investigation into diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across state government, including the Universities of Wisconsin system. Now, these auditors are nonpartisan researchers, but this audit was ordered by the Republican-controlled state legislature and comes at a time when conservatives across the country are looking into efficiencies in government. Now, we sat down with the co-chair of the legislature's audit committee, Senator Eric Wimberger of Oconto, for more on what the next steps of this audit process could entail. Hammering down like a little bit more in the UW stuff, at that kind of 30,000 foot view, qualitatively, what did we see in this audit?
Well, they have at the Regents their own definition of DEI, which is different than the DOA stuff. Harder to pare down in that regard because we were using Executive Order 59 for the other things, and the Regents have their own definition. But I guess in the most general sense, a lot of money is being spent on things that don't have clear definitions and not a lot of compliance, but a demand to keep doing it. And that's aside from the philosophy, and which I certainly am not happy with either, but whatever you're going to do within government, it ought to at least have a plan, which they don't, and effectively done. So there's kind of a problem on both sides of that.
So we'd seen your statement late last week in reaction to this, but kind of what's the Republican caucus thinking? What are your thoughts after seeing what the audit found?
Well, they've got a lot of people working and not actually doing anything. Going to conferences, people getting paid salaries. The whole issue at UW-Madison with their DEI coordinator, who after was supposed to stop doing things, actually did some inappropriate things with the money before anybody could stop it from happening. So conferences, travel, salaries, a lot of committees that meet and nothing ever happens, meeting often, and it adds up. We're talking tens of millions of dollars. I think the difficult part in some of this is that the people doing the good work, which is pre-Order 59 and kind of like the 1970s, 1972, I want to say, there was an affirmative action law that was, I guess, a more normal and right way to handle things, which is non-discrimination. That has been, the people who are doing that are also assigned this DEI stuff. So how do you actually come up with a number? Some of this is a little bit hard to digest because we want those people to still do non-discrimination work. But some of these things regarding DEI specifically have to do with making people feel good or feel included, which is an externalizing sort of behavior. Over the years, there might have been good intentions from some people, but when you're trying to chase after making somebody feel a certain way, it affords for bad actors and, in my opinion, grifters to then never be satisfied until you provide more money and more things. And I think it's created an environment of extremism as a result.
So looking at the next steps for the legislature, I understand next week you have a hearing. Will we see any legislation coming out of this? What do some of those next steps look like?
I think still too early on the legislation. The idea of DEI, that's a categorization, a label. And can you just relabel things and now it's not DEI? It's a slippery issue to try and pare down, and in my opinion, make sure the non-discrimination happens, rather than trying to create stereotypes and and adjust for. I mean, in my opinion, DEI is discrimination, and we're combining and conflating the issues. How do you handle that is tough. I think we'll figure it out, but at least I can, with the audit, expose what's happening, and then maybe come to some solutions going forward. We are in a budget year, so I think it's a good time to then require the departments that are doing these things to actually come with solid numbers and plans and things, and have them come to a quantifiable position that we can deal with and negotiate.
No, we're recording this before the Supreme Court has handed down that decision on the, so to speak, 400-year veto that would impact the budget process, certainly. But when we saw back in 2023, kind of the trade-off was that hiring freeze. Do you have a sense of whether we'll see anything similar? Could we see the legislature try and reduce
for
some
the
of these
UW
positions?
or
for the UW?
Don't know. That was really due to the engineering building, and those positions were labeled DEI positions. And an audit is a snapshot of a moment, and so the auditors go in and they make a report. Perhaps in the last couple of months there has been some movement, and we'll hash that out. And I suppose that's why we have hearings, is to see if there's something that's already happening. I don't think there's a desire to be punitive about anything. It's just, please stop doing that, you know. And we'll figure it out and focus on the real things that matter, which is non-discrimination and getting people education to be a success in life, wherever they came from.
To the budget point, though, no discussion so far about any kind of eliminating positions in DEI or reassigning people yet in the budget process? And it might be early yet.
No. I think that because a lot of these guys are doing things at half-time or a quarter of their time, how do you adjust staff to do that? Yeah, there's a certain number of FTE positions where these things are happening, but if you were to cut that number of people, you're cutting jobs where the rest of what they do is also. But there are certain things that are easy to cut, I suppose. Quit going. You're not going to you're not going on this junket for 5,000. I mean, those are some easy ones, yes, that I will certainly be advocating they don't do. But as far as the positions go, that's a trickier wicket.
When we come back, we look at the results of this month's state Supreme Court election through an environmental lens. A staff attorney with Clean Wisconsin shares what environmental cases could be on the docket. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. Earth Day is this coming Tuesday with some history of that holiday here in Wisconsin. Former Wisconsin Governor and Senator Gaylord Nelson was one of the political forces behind the holiday. And as we're looking ahead to celebrate, we turn to the role of the courts in shaping environmental policy here in Wisconsin, especially in the wake of this April's state Supreme Court race. Now, for more on that conversation, we spoke with Evan Feinauer, staff attorney at Clean Wisconsin. Here's more. So when we, just as journalists, cover these races, try and help people understand kind of what the importance, what the role of the courts are. Anecdotally, we've heard some people say, oh, the Supreme Court, they must deal with murders, right? These supreme criminal cases. Yeah. When we talk about environmental regulation and that kind of stuff, how often does it come before the court? In what kind of vein do we see that?
Yeah, every term there's definitely a few cases that are going to infect the environment or public health that are important. And you know, the court doesn't take that many cases. They have discretion over their docket. So just because somebody appeals doesn't mean they got to hear the case. So they control their docket. And so what they're going to look for is cases that are going to have either novel issues, like, hey, nobody's ever fought about this before in court and we want to resolve it, or it's important on a statewide basis. So this is going to affect a lot of people in a bunch of different places. So that's what they're looking for. And we get a few of these every term. And you know, they do have to deal with all these cases. They do have to deal with criminal cases, and they have to deal with all kinds of different stuff. So there's not a ton of these cases, but what that means is over time is that the few cases they decide every year are really important indications of how the court's thinking about environmental law and administrative law across a wider range of cases. And a lot of what that comes down to is agency authority. A lot of these cases turn on the agency did something, did they have the authority to do that? And when the agency does something that environmentalists like, we often are in the position of saying that the agency did have authority, and then vice versa, and that's kind of the fight that the litigants have then in court. But what you want to have is a nice durable set of expectations about what the agency can and can't do, regardless of who's in charge of the agency, so that everybody understands what the kind of rules are.
Yeah, kind of play by the same rules.
Yes.
Idea there. In terms of what we're looking at on the current docket, I know we just had that election, but that justice won't be seated until late this summer. What are we seeing that could be coming down within the next couple of months here?
Yeah, there's some potentially pretty big cases, and these are cases that affect the environment, but they also affect stuff beyond the environment. So we have the Evers versus Markline case, which is a big case that was argued either late last year or early this year, and that has to do with one of these big separation of powers cases, right? So the separation of powers is got the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. They're each supposed to stay kind of in their lane. They can go a little bit out of their lane, but not too much. I won't bore you with the exact language that the courts use, but that's basically the idea. And what the Evers administration did in its lawsuit is say, whoa, 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 some of these joint legislative committees are coming too much into our executive lane by blocking rules, which are law, that these agencies are writing to effectuate statutes, to make the statutes work.
Would be like an example of an administrative role.
Yeah, so the ones that have gotten hung up in the case itself involved, that were environmental, involved building codes. So this is actually not DNR, but a different agency is supposed to update building codes periodically, and the statute tells them to do this. And one of the things that the building codes get updated to do is to track the most recent iteration of efficiency codes. So as an environmentalist, we love that, right? Making buildings more efficient, reducing their carbon footprint, so on and so forth. But they got stymied from doing that by one of these joint legislative committees. And the problem is, as the lawsuit alleges, is that what that does is it gives this legislative veto that allows the legislature to simultaneously tell by statute, executive branch, go do something, and then they do it, and then they say, well, we don't like how you did it. And there's this question of whether or not they have the front end and the back end authority, or whether or not that veers too much into themselves exercising executive branch authority. And the court took the arguments very seriously, because this is a big deal. Because if we got rid of some of these legislative vetoes, which by the way a lot of states have because they've found separation of powers problems, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power between the legislature and the executive with regard to these proposed agency rules, because the agencies would no longer be able to, on the back end, stop them from going into effect based on objections or just suspending the rule multiple times, that kind of thing. So, Clean Wisconsin, for example, put a friend of the court or amicus brief in that case saying, this building code example is actually a good example of why this is problematic. We had this long stakeholder process, everybody got to say their piece, and then when the rule got to the legislature, it was sort of suspended in a sort of perfunctory way that didn't really provide a lot of democratic validity to it. It wasn't terribly transparent, and it didn't address the long public process that had happened before it. So we thought it was pretty objectionable that it had played out that way, and also updating the building codes is important. And so we thought it was a problematic example of this and urged the court to take up that issue. So that's a big structural one, and that wouldn't just be agency rules affecting the environment. Like I said, that's everything, because the agencies do stuff that touch our lives in a bunch of different ways. So that's potentially a big one.
So not to, kind of prejudge, so to speak, what the court might be doing in the future, but we imagine at least the ideological makeup of the court will be similar in the future to what it is right now. Any kind of big environmental issues that you might see on the horizon, post-August?
Yeah, sure. So there's always a number of cases that are kind of midstream. They're in the lower courts. And you don't know. They could be settled. A party could just decide not to appeal, and so they might never reach the Supreme Court. But there are ones that I at least am keeping a close eye on, because I think they could be important in the future, and they could reach the Supreme Court in the next year or two. So there's a case called Rice versus DNR. This is R-E-I-S-S, I believe. I believe it's pronounced Rice. And this is a sort of odd case about fan boats and their use on waters. And so this has raised a bunch of questions about the public trust doctrine. The public trust doctrine is a really important Wisconsin constitutional principle that says Navigable waters are open to all citizens of the state. Nobody owns them. The state holds title, but only in trust for the benefit of all Wisconsin's residents. And so what you have to do is you have to figure out, okay, well, where does the public trust doctrine start and stop? Because obviously if I live on a river or a lake, well, I have my property rights on the upland where the river stops. And drawing that line is, as you can imagine, led to a large number of disputes. And so this has raised a question of whether or not the courts are going to have to revisit something known as the wet feet rule or feet wet rule, which is if your feet are wet where you are, you're good to go, you can exercise your public trust rights, you can fish, you can swim, whatever. Because these fan boats, of course, you could be in like 2 inches of water and you could be hundreds of feet up on somebody's land potentially, or at least that's what's alleged. I've never been on a fan boat. And so you could imagine somebody saying, well, that doesn't really quite work in this situation, or it makes us rethink whether or not there's more nuance there. For its part, the department is saying, well, we have the wet feet policy, and that we should just leave things the way the courts interpreted it for a long time. But I'm keeping an eye on it because it could be a potential problem to unsettle all those expectations about where folks have rights to be in public waters.
We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. We'll leave you with a quick note on the week ahead. Both chambers of the state legislature will be back in session on Tuesday, debating a slate of legislation, including some proposals on criminal justice. And that does it for us this week. I'm Will Keneally. Have a great rest of your weekend.
This has been For the Record